I always knew that my childhood home was more than just an old, creaky house. Growing up, I'd heard the stories, whispers from my grandparents, murmurs from my parents, but they always brushed them off as just that, stories. Now, years later, the house was set to be demolished. My parents had moved away, and my siblings had long since started families of their own. But I, feeling an odd pull, decided to spend one final night alone in the house before it was gone forever. As I drove up the long, winding driveway, memories flooded my mind, playing in the garden, sneaking into the attic with my brother, the smell of my mother's cooking wafting through the halls. The house loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the evening sky, its windows like eyes watching me approach. I shivered, not just from the cold, but from the eerie familiarity that settled over me like a heavy blanket. The first few hours were peaceful. I wandered through the empty rooms, letting nostalgia wash over me. The living room still had the same old furniture, covered in dust and draped in white sheets. I ran my fingers over the fabric, stirring up little clouds of dust that danced in the fading sunlight. The kitchen, once full of warmth and life, now stood cold and empty. I decided to light a fire in the fireplace, hoping to chase away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. As the fire crackled to life, I settled into my old armchair, pulling a blanket over myself. The house creaked and groaned as it always had, the familiar sounds oddly comforting. I closed my eyes, letting myself drift back to the simpler days of my childhood. But as the night deepened, the house began to change. The once comforting creaks grew louder, more deliberate, as if the house itself were waking up after a long slumber. The wind outside picked up, howling through the cracks in the windows, but I could have sworn I heard something else, whispers, faint and indistinct, like a distant conversation. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out the words. They seemed to be coming from all around me, filling the room with a palpable sense of dread. The fire flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls that seemed to move of their own accord. I stood, clutching the blanket around me like a shield. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, suffocating silence. I took a hesitant step toward the hallway, where the darkness seemed to pulse and throb like a living thing. The moment I stepped into the hallway, the temperature dropped, my breath visible in the air. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the walls, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to get out of the house as fast as I could. But something rooted me to the spot, a cold, paralyzing fear that I hadn't felt since I was a child. Then I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the attic, a slow, deliberate creak, like someone or something was moving up there. The attic, where my brother and I had played as children, where we had once heard strange noises but had always been too afraid to investigate. The whispers returned, now unmistakable and close, too close. They were coming from the attic stairs just around the corner. My heart raced, my hands shaking as I reached out to the wall for support. But the whispers turned towards my name, being called out in a voice that was both familiar and horrifying. "Jack." I gasped, backing away, my mind reeling. The voice sounded like my brother's, but that was impossible. He was miles away, safe in his own home. "Jack, come play with us," the voice whispered again, but this time it was joined by another voice and then another, until the hallway was filled with a cacophony of distorted voices, all calling my name. Terrified, I turned and ran back to the living room, but the moment I crossed the threshold, the fire died out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more urgent, as if whatever was in the house was closing in on me. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone, desperately trying to call for help, but the screen was dead, no signal, no power. The whispers were now right behind me, and I could feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, expecting to see something horrible, but the room was empty, the shadows dancing on the walls in the dying light of the fire's embers. But the whispers didn't stop, they intensified, growing louder, more frantic, until I couldn't take it anymore. In a blind panic, I ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was holding me captive, refusing to let me leave. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the only response was the relentless whispering, growing closer and closer. Suddenly, everything stopped. The whispers, the shadows, the cold all gone in an instant. The house was silent, eerily so, as if it had never been anything but peaceful. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow darker than the others, standing at the foot of the stairs. And before I could react, the shadow lunged at me, and everything went black. When my parents next morning, they found the house in perfect order, except for one thing: I was gone, with no trace of me ever having been there. The only sign of me was the faint sound of whispers that seemed to echo through the walls, growing fainter with each passing day, until the house was finally demolished and the whispers were silenced forever. The old manor house at the edge of town had always been shrouded in mystery for decades. It stood abandoned, its windows darkened, and its walls whispering secrets from another time no one dared to enter, not after what happened to the last family who lived there. Rumors swirled about something sinister residing within, something that watched and waited in the dark. When I heard about the manor, my curiosity was piqued. Despite the warnings and eerie tales, I couldn't resist the urge to explore it for myself. Armed with a flashlight and my camera, I set out one cold, moonless night, determined to debunk the local legends. The door creaked open with little resistance, almost as if it had been expecting me. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, but I pressed on, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I ventured deeper into the house, capturing every detail with my camera. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, but I dismissed it as just the power of suggestion. After all, the stories about the house were just that, stories. After what felt like an hour of exploring, I found myself in the grand bedroom, the heart of the manor. The room was surprisingly well preserved, with a large 4-poster bed dominating the space. Heavy drapes hung from the windows, blocking out any light from outside. But what caught my attention was the shadow in the corner. This was no ordinary shadow. It was darker than the rest of the room, almost as if it absorbed the light. It didn't move, yet something about it made my skin crawl. I pointed my flashlight at the shadow, but the beam seemed to disappear into the darkness. A cold chill ran down my spine. My camera caught the exact moment when I first noticed the shadow. I took a cautious step closer, curiosity starting to overcome my fear, but as I did, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The shadow seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. Then, without warning, it moved. It stretched across the floor, slithering like a serpent, until it was directly beneath the bed. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. A low, guttural sound emanated from under the bed, like the growl of some hidden beast. My flashlight flickered, casting the room in intermittent darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The shadow beneath the bed began to rise, taking shape, forming into something monstrous, something that had been waiting in the dark for years. Its eyes, red and glowing, stared back at me with a hunger that froze my blood. Finally, I broke free from my paralysis and bolted from the room, not daring to look back. I sprinted through the halls, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. Whatever it was following me, hunting me. I reached the front door, threw it open, and stumbled into the night, gasping for air. The manor loomed behind me, silent and dark, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The shadow was still there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter its domain. It had tasted fear again, and it would not rest until it fed once more.